Today, the Library of Babel podcast turns its attention to a very special work, a very strange medieval poem which is called Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. I first heard of the poem, like many others in recent years, I assume, after watching a great horror movie called The Green Knight. After watching the movie a few times, I wanted to read the original medieval poem that inspired it, and found it, the poem, even stranger, foreign and unexplained, and in an effort to understand at least some of its context, I've listened to a series of lectures, not just on the poem itself, but also on the literature the poem belongs to. The literature surrounding King Arthur and his court at Camelot. Now, today I'm honored to be joined by the professor who taught the course. She's Professor Dorsey Armstrong, and the course is called King Arthur, History and Legend, and is a part of the Great Courses series. Professor Armstrong specializes in medieval English literature and language, Arthurian literature, Anglo-Saxon language and literature, and gender and feminist studies. So much of what we're going to talk about today, I guess. So, hi, Dorsey. And the first question I like to start with is, how would you introduce Sir Gawain and the Green Knight to someone who has never heard of it before and even didn't watch the movie, which is a great movie?
Thank you so much for having me. I am always happy to talk about Arthurian literature, and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is a poem that is one of the finest examples of Arthurian literature we have from the Middle Ages, bar none. This poem survives in just a single manuscript, so we don't know exactly how popular or widespread it was, if it was circulated, if it was read a lot, or if the story was known in the medieval period, but it is so exquisitely written, so carefully structured. And as you just said, it participates in a very broad tradition of Arthurian literature that was gaining in popularity and in fact exploding in terms of numbers of texts that deal with the legend of King Arthur from about the 12th century through to the 15th. And Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is right in the 14th century. It is the story of the young Sir Gawain, who is a relatively unproven knight at King Arthur's court. And the story goes that at Christmas, when they're all celebrating, into the court strides this man who looks more like a tree than a man. He's a green man. He's all green. His horse is green. And he says he would like to play a Christmas game. And the court, first of all, is kind of shocked at this stranger's appearance. He's really weird looking. And so he says, what I want is to play essentially a wounding game. Some people call it the beheading game, but if you read carefully, he doesn't specifically say, let's chop each other's heads off. But that's what happens. So he says, I want someone to give me a blow, and in a year's time, I will give that same blow back to the person who gave it to me. And as you can imagine, the knights in the court are kind of astonished because has this person just entered and asked for suicide by night, essentially, right? No one is going to be so rude as to kill someone because he seems a little bit deranged. But then he chides the court. He says, what, is this Arthur's house? I heard you guys were amazing. No one's going to play my game. So finally, Gawain jumps up. He says he'll do it. He chops off the Green Knight's head, much to everyone's surprise, especially Gawain. The Green Knight stands up, picks up his head, says, I'll see ya in a year. You got to come find me at the Green Chapel. Toodaloo. Have a good time worrying about that for the next 365 days. And out he goes. And so then the next part of the poem involves Gawain getting ready to leave. He goes on his journey and he is looking everywhere for the Green Chapel. Doesn't know where it is, but he thinks he'll find it. And he stumbles finally upon this lovely house in what's more like a castle in the middle of nowhere that suddenly appears. And there's a gracious host and a beautiful lady there. And they give him welcome. And they say that the Green Chapel is very nearby. So until it's time for him to go and meet his fate, why doesn't he rest here? And then a whole series of interesting events happen at the castle that we can talk about in more detail in a moment. And finally, he goes to meet his destiny. He survives And I can talk more about that too, although he does get a nick on the neck. He then returns to Arthur's court, but because of many things that have happened while he's been staying in the castle, he feels as if perhaps he cheated in winning this contest because he has accepted a gift that is a girdle, a green girdle, that supposedly has magic in it so that anyone who wears it cannot be killed. And so it's unclear at some point if has he cheated by accepting this gift? Does he really believe that the girdle is going to protect him in the way he thinks it is? And in the end, when he's discovered and called out, and the Green Knight himself says, "It's okay. You loved your life. You didn't want to die. So I forgive you." But Gawain says, "I have shamed myself. I didn't fulfill the terms of the bargain completely." He goes back to court, announces his shame. All the rest of Arthur's court says, "No way, you did a great job. We all want to join you in what you think is shame, but we think is honor. So we're all going to wear green girdles too." And that is a quick synopsis, but I've left out a lot of juicy details, which I think we can get to later on in our conversation. So Gawain doesn't die.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's so much to bite on just by that recap, and it's very interesting. You started out by saying that the poem survived only in one manuscript, which brings to mind Beowulf, for example, which also only survived in one manuscript. But the poet itself, I mean, the narrator of the poem, claims that he's telling us a known story, and
Yes.
that. Yeah, he's also telling it, I think he says in one point, a straightforward tale. He's not going to embellish anything. Is it to emphasize that here lies a true story?
So I would say that I don't think we're meant in any real sense to believe that this is a true story. But what the poet is careful to do is establish his or her, we don't know, bona fides by at the very beginning structuring this poem to be engaged with a long tradition of Arthurian storytelling. So he starts the poem at Troy, which if you're an undergraduate reading it for the first time, you might just skip over this part. But it's really, really important because the idea that Britain was founded by survivors from Troy and or their descendants becomes really crucial in the self-narrative about the identity of Britain, because it gives it a heritage that goes all the way back to the classical world. So in a way, this reference to Troy is very, very common, especially in Arthurian literature, and it is a way of signaling that the tradition of Britain has its roots in the classical world. It's not some newfangled set of mythologies or stories. And so, in the sense that the poet says this is a true story, what he's saying is this belongs to an important body of literature that has been held to be revered, and it's no upstart literature. It's no newfangled thing. That we have a long and ancient and proud history. And so that is part of what he says when he says what he means when he says I'm telling a true story. It's true in the sense that he is speaking as the chronicles speak. So whether or not medieval chronicles are true or not, they are meant to be understood as conveying truths.
Yeah, this is very interesting. I mean, in a sense that we are talking about a huge and complex literature, and in one of, in the exact lecture that you gave about the Green Knight, about the poem, you said that maybe I'm going too deep too soon, but it is an English push to the French tradition of Sir Lancelot and so on. So what is this Arthurian literature? Because it's very old, and it has, as you said, when the poem is transcribed or written, there's an explosion of other
Yes.
Arthurian literature at the same time. But
Right.
it is much older, right?
Oh, yes. So the origins of the Arthurian story go back at least to about the year 600, which is when we have the first text that mentions Arthur by name. And according to legend, he was a leader who in the late 5th, early 6th century, after the Roman legions have withdrawn from Britain when Rome has been sacked. There's chaos in Britain. So for almost 400 years, people in most of Britain, not to the north in Scotland, and not all the way to the west in Wales, but most people in Britain would think of themselves as Roman citizens. And when the Goths sack Rome in 410, Rome pulls back all of its auxiliary resources and troops to protect the capital itself. And so you have people who consider themselves Roman citizens for 400 years or so, suddenly left defenseless against all kinds of marauders. And that's a whole lecture we could spend a whole lot of time talking about. But the short version is somebody had to do something to fight off Picts that are coming down from Scotland, Scots that are coming from Ireland. Yes, that's what happens. They don't come from the places you think they are. Scots come from Ireland, Picts come from Scotland. There's a bunch of Germanic invaders coming from the continent. And in the midst of this chaos, it seems as if some person, or maybe a couple people, who end up being the basis for Arthur, managed to rally the survivors behind a cause and hold back these invasions and provide a time of prosperity for at least a couple generations, according to archaeological evidence. And so what happens then very gradually over those next centuries, where we don't have a lot of texts that mention Arthur, but he does show up, there's this memory that somebody with a name like Arthur helped bring peace during a time of chaos. Things really take off in the 12th century when a guy called Geoffrey of Monmouth claims that he has a book written in the very ancient British language, so probably something like Welsh, and it's a whole history of the kings of Britain. And the majority section of this book is about Arthur. And he says, I'm going to translate this out of the British tongue into Latin. And this text is what really launches the Arthurian legend into the stratosphere. Over 200 manuscript copies survive, and that's a huge number for the 12th century. Just enormous, which means there must have been many, many more that we've lost. It gets translated and circulated into a whole bunch of vernacular languages, like French. And then that is what seems to inspire this literary explosion, especially in the French in the 12th and 13th centuries. You have thousands upon thousands of pages of stories of King Arthur and the exploits of his knights. This is when we get the Holy Grail coming into the legend. It's hugely popular. And as you said at the beginning, or just a moment ago, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is important because it is in English. And so between Geoffrey and the 14th century, most of the important Arthurian texts, there's a few exceptions, but they're written in French. This is a moment when an English writer takes back the legend, as you say, focuses not on Lancelot, focuses on the native-born son, Sir Gawain, nephew of the king. And it is just a beautifully crafted, fantastic piece of literature. I have to believe that the story itself must have circulated in some other form. We just don't have any copies that survive. So it's after this point that we start to see the English taking back the Arthurian legend. And I would say the culmination of that is at the end of the 15th century when Sir Thomas Malory writes his Morte d'Arthur, which is the largest, most comprehensive, consecutively ordered story of the legend of King Arthur before the modern period. Malory, an Englishman, takes multiple sources in English and in French, and he says, you know, we've had this story for this knight over here, and this story over here, and this tale of how Arthur got his crown. I'm going to start at the very beginning. I'm going to borrow from all these different sources, and I'm going to try and tell the story in order, and I'm going to try and include as many knights who go on adventures as well, and then end up at the end. And if you want to really understand the Arthurian legend as a whole in the Middle Ages, I would suggest you start with Malory. It's available now in modern translations, although the Middle English isn't that hard. And so I think it's a cracking good read. And that would be where, if you want to get a sense of the whole scope of the Arthurian world, that's where I would go.
And Malory uses, I mean, he knows Sir Gawain and the Green Knight?
Doesn't seem clear. Again, this is why Gawain stands out, this poem, because it's not in Malory. Malory borrows from another English poem known as the Alliterative Morte Arthur. He especially borrows from the French tradition, from what we call the Vulgate and post-Vulgate tradition, the prose Lancelot, some other texts, the Suite du Merlin, and some other works, the Book of Sir Lancelot and Queen Guinevere. But the specific story of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight does not show up in Malory, which again makes it this truly unique, fascinating text, because maybe he didn't know it. Maybe that's why it doesn't show up.
Yeah, again, I'm thinking about Beowulf, and in another sense that let's think about the character of Sir Gawain, which I don't know if you'll agree with me, but it doesn't seem to have a lot of psychological complexity. I mean, he's a noble knight, he's a good knight. I mean, he knows how to talk to women. He's a love talker. I think you refer to it in your lecture. I mean, he knows that, but he's the perfect noble knight, just like Beowulf, and not like Sir Lancelot, or I think about Achilles or some other great knight or a noble warrior who is very much more complex and much more hesitant about the culture, the warrior ethos. Sir Gawain doesn't seem to have a lot of problem with nobility, and I think that in the end, as you said, he's ashamed because maybe he doesn't look at what he did. I mean, he's scared of death, basically, which is so natural.
Right. He's scared of death. But at the same time, what's fascinating about this Gawain is how different he is from so many other Gawains. So very often when I teach the Arthurian legend, I ask students to attach, say, an adjective to a knight that sort of encapsulates what they are. So Sir Kay, who is King Arthur's foster brother, and ends up being his seneschal and is always in a bad mood, the adjective they always come up with is grumpy. Kay is grumpy. He's always causing problems. He is rude to people who come to court. He's always in a bad mood. Lancelot, the word they use is chivalrous. He is the embodiment of chivalry, of serving ladies, especially his queen. Gawain, except for in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, otherwise he is vengeful. And so it's very interesting to see this Gawain, who is not vengeful. As you say, he is trying very hard to follow the code of honor that Arthur's court has set up. And I would argue that he really does the best he can in an impossible situation. A game is happening later on in the poem that he is not even aware he is playing. And just briefly, what happens is when he's staying at the court of Lord Bertilac and his wife, right before he's going to the Green Chapel, Bertilac says, "Let's play a game. And the game is, I will go out every day and go hunting. You need to rest up, so you stay in bed here. At the end of each day, I will give you whatever I get from the hunt. You will give me whatever it is you manage to get while you're here, lying around in bed in the castle." So right away, this seems like an odd game. What is he going to get or achieve or obtain if he's just resting while the Lord is out hunting, and in some cases, some very dangerous animals? And what happens is every morning while the Lord is gone, the lady comes to Gawain's chamber, chats him up, essentially throws herself at him. And in order to honor his host, of course, Gawain can't give in to any of her advances. But he also can't be rude to ladies. So he's trapped. And on some occasions, he's literally trapped in his bed because he's naked under the covers. She comes in and sits down on the edge of the bed. He can't get out because then he'd be naked in front of the lady. But he also can't tell her to get out because that would be rude. And so he manages to do this, what he calls love talking, which is a way of engaging in flirty banter without it going too far. And at the end of each day, she asks for a kiss, which he gives her. It's a pretty chaste kiss. So the Lord returns, having hunted all day, and says, "Here, I killed this deer for you. What'd you get?" And Gawain gives him a kiss on the cheek, which is correct and a truthful accounting of what he got that day. What he doesn't know in the end, this goes on and on, is that Bertilac has set Gawain up. Bertilac has instructed his wife to try and seduce Gawain each day as a means of testing him. And so poor Gawain really doesn't know that the odds are stacked against him. The final thing that happens that is where I think Gawain deserves a little credit for having done the best he can in an impossible situation is on the last day, the lady says to him, I want to give you a gift. And Gawain says immediately, no, do not give me a gift, because Gawain knows I'm going to have to give that to the Lord. So what's the point? So he refuses, first of all, a ring. And then she comes at him again. Well, then wear this girdle that is magic, that protects the wearer from death. And what we don't know at this point is if Gawain just says, you know what, she's just going to keep offering me gifts, so I better accept this girdle. Maybe she'll stop if I just accept it. And we don't know. We don't have a look into his mind if he's thinking, I will take it and then I'll give it back to the Lord. Because then the very next moment she says, thank you for accepting the gift. And now I ask that you don't tell my Lord that I gave it to you. So he's really stuck now because he accepted her gift, which is only polite, especially after he turned down the first one. To honor his commitment to the game he's playing with his host, he should have to turn that gift over. But a lady just asked him not to reveal it. And then you add to the fact that it's magical and might save his life, and he knows he's on his way to maybe get his head chopped off. You can see how stuck he is and just not sure what to do. And in the end, he thinks he failed. When I teach this in my classes, usually most students say, I think he did the best he could, given how trapped he was in this situation. And then I always ask them, what would you do?
And what do they answer?
I get a whole range. I get people saying, well, you know what? I would have just been rude from the very beginning and asked her to get out of my room. I wouldn't have played this game. And then we have to bring it back to, no, we're talking about a society in which these conventions and the guest-host relationship are of critical importance. So that's really not an option. How do you handle it? And usually, again, they all come back to, I think he handled it the best he could.
By reading all the tests and all the things he has to go through, it seems to me that, there's this quote, I don't remember who said it, but the past is a foreign land. I mean, it
Yeah.
does seem that, it's such a strange world. First of all, the chopping of heads. I mean, this weird game, but it is also a weird game for the court, as you said. So nobody
Yes, and
volunteers for it.
right. Well, so what's interesting is that the head chopping may refer to a really, really ancient motif of games that exists in pre-Christian Celtic storytelling. So there seems to be some evidence that what's happening here, although we're in Arthur's court and it is Christmas time and it's a Christian court, there are these traces of a pagan past that are surfacing through the text, not least of which is the Green Man, which, if anyone has been to a garden store, you know that the Green Man has long been the sort of face with trees and leaves and branches coming out of it. The Green Man is a symbol of the natural world, of fertility, of fecundity. And so, in a sense, what's happening is the Green Knight, representing the natural world, the forest, is coming into the civilized world. And so civilization and the pagan wild past are sort of in this moment in conflict with each other. What's also interesting is the fact that he's a symbol of the natural world. The Green Knight does not have a sword. He has an axe. So he has a woodsman's weapon rather than a knight's weapon. And so there's this other level happening where there's power in the natural world, in the pagan past, and sometimes it is at odds with the civilized Christian present of the poem.
Which is, the poem is getting resolved in the end in such a, I don't know, not a very convincing way, because we do discover that the Green Knight is Bertilac, the lord of the castle.
Right.
And it's actually all a ploy to get the queen to pass out and get a stroke from
Yeah,
fear.
so this is the other strange part of the poem. So it's one twist is when we find out, first of all, that Bertilac and the Green Knight are the same person and have been all along. And the Green Knight reveals this when Gawain shows up at the appointed time to get his head chopped off. But then the Green Knight tells us, everything that my lady did, she did at my instruction. Okay, so the lady's character suddenly becomes different in our estimation because was she acting of her own free will? Doesn't seem so. Her husband told her to go seduce this knight. But then it's more than that. There's another layer. When the Green Knight / Bertilac says, and this whole thing was set up by Morgan Le Fay, King Arthur's sister, your aunt, because she wanted to scare Guinevere to death at that initial celebration. So if you think about it, this also seems odd and doesn't make a lot of sense, because if the whole point is let's scare Guinevere to death or at least make her pass out, you send the Green Knight in at Christmas time, he gets his head chopped off, he picks it up, he walks out of court after saying, I'll see you in a year. Did it scare Guinevere to death? Nope. In fact, the whole time Gawain has been sitting near Guinevere and speaking politely to her and making sure she's okay. So that it failed. It didn't work. So if the initial goal was to scare Guinevere to death and that didn't work, why does the rest of the poem continue? Because Guinevere is not at the Green Chapel, right? She's back safely in Camelot. And so a year goes by. She presumably hasn't fainted or collapsed or had a stroke or whatever. Gawain sets out. She wishes him well as he goes out on his journey. So why see it through to the end if the supposed reason for it in the beginning never comes to pass and won't come to pass? This is another puzzle in the poem. Why are we doing any of this to begin with?
And what is one solution you came by or you thought about?
Most people think that the message here is about attempting to maintain honor and engage in honorable behavior in difficult situations. And so on the one hand, when Gawain returns to court and says, I have shamed everyone, I failed, I didn't do my job, I didn't fulfill my task, I didn't complete the quest in the way that I should have. What happens almost immediately is that the other knights hear the story and say, in fact, you did an amazing job. And in order to recuperate Gawain back into the court and reclaim him, they take what was a mark of shame, the green girdle, and they say, we can't have you stand out all by yourself, and we don't think it's shameful. So we're all going to adopt the same emblem because no one could have done this better than you did. Even though you think you failed, we think you succeeded, and we think that that partial success was a huge triumph, and therefore we're going to honor it by all of us remembering and acknowledging by wearing these green girdles. So on one level, it is about the need of the community to protect, maintain, and take the stories about the feats and adventures of the knights who are members of the community and bring it back into the collective so that it brings honor and status and perhaps elevates the round table as a whole. So it turns what looked like a weakness into a strength.
So it is in the end a test for Sir Gawain. I mean, it's not about the queen or a plot to kill her.
Even though we get that line that says that's what it was all about, it's really hard to believe that given everything that's just happened. It's like a red herring. Because if that's what it's about, it didn't work.
Yeah, and it actually makes no sense to continue and test him. I mean, not just to bring him to the chapel. Anytime I think about, even when I read the poem, it's like I don't know, reading about Claudius and not being able not to picture the TV series,
Sure,
the old one. I mean, I'm always watching. I'm always picturing the movie, which came out not that long ago. I mean, a few years ago. What did you thought about the movie? Because it seems to me that it's more suited to our modern sensibility, which is almost obvious, but the plot is much more mysterious because we don't know who is the Green Knight, and we actually don't know by the end even what happened to Sir Gawain.
So we're
Yeah.
talking about David Lowery's film, The Green
Yeah.
Knight, with Dev Patel. So this is a brilliant, beautiful piece of filmmaking. And what it does really well, I think, is it takes the parts of the poem that are just the quick mentions here and there, and it sort of takes the story and inverts it or shows us the obverse. So in the poem, Gawain sets out on this adventure to go find the Green Knight at the Green Chapel. And what would normally be the major part of any sort of knightly quest, which is the journey through dangers, and you have to fight monsters and deal with giants and other events on your way to reaching the end point of your quest, the poem skips over that. What the film does is show us that those moments that are just barely alluded to, and expands on them and really opens them up and emphasizes what kind of struggles he goes through just to get to the end point. Whereas in the poem, we start at Camelot and then we move pretty quickly to Bertilac's castle. Most of the film is in between these two spaces. And I think that's one thing it does really, really brilliantly.
Yeah, and even by the end of the poem, there's a funny line that the poet says that while traveling home, Sir Gawain encounters so many adventures and so many things, but I'm not going to tell you anything about them. I have
Yeah,
to finish in a sense.
right. So the poem is about what happens in the courts and in Bertilac's house and then at the Green Chapel. Um, the film is a little bit, but it's more about what's happening in between, and also deals with a much more intense level of interiority and fallibility for that Gawain than we see in the poem. At the end of the poem, Gawain is upset with himself and thinks he's failed. In the film, we see Gawain struggling on literally a daily, sometimes minute by minute basis to do the right thing, to understand who he is and who he should be as the nephew of the king, who is perhaps going to be the heir to the throne. And he is very unfinished. He is very flawed. And we don't see that in the same way in the poem. So the film is about a flawed man sort of launching himself into the next phase of his life and seeking to become honorable when he does it.
Yeah, it does seem like the poem the poem is a celebration of the
Mhm.
knighthood, and the film is actually, I don't know, showing us the disadvantages of this male culture, which is Gawain has, as he starts, he's being beaten by a woman and almost dies. Or is dead. It's there's various interpretation there. I'm thinking about there's a term from Marvel Universe, the canon. I mean, every story about Spider-Man has to contain the death of Uncle Ben.
Sure.
So, would you say that Mallory created the Arthurian canon in a sense
I would
with
say
Sir
that
Lancelot? I mean, he didn't.
I would say I wouldn't say that Mallory creates it. I would say that he solidified it. So I would say that it's already been established in multiple texts, and he sort of gives the final stamp of approval that this is how we read Lancelot, this is how we read Gawain. And what's interesting, as I noted earlier, and as you mentioned, is that the Gawain of Mallory is not like the Gawain of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. So that's one reason why this poem is always a surprise to people who have some familiarity with the legend, because unless they've studied Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, they have a very different view of Gawain than the way he's represented here, or for that matter, in the film.
And in the other story, he's that young and unproven.
So in Mallory, he starts out fairly young, goes on to prove himself, and becomes sort of one of Arthur's right-hand men for most of the poem. He's about, sorry, the text in Mallory's text. Um, in this poem, we're in the youth of Arthur's court, so everyone's young, right? The Green Knight comes in and he actually makes fun of the court. So Arthur's court's at its height. It's supposed to be amazing. And the Green Knight looks around and says, "What are all these beardless boys? You all look like children." Whereas film versions of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight tend almost universally to paint Arthur as at the end of his life. The court is sort of in decline. And so there's a need for sort of fresh blood in the form of Gawain to take up the mantle. But the poem itself is pretty clear that this is Arthur's court at its apogee.
Yeah. I mean, Arthur is I mean, he's young, he's almost boyish in a sense that
Yes.
he jumps her. He wants to strike at the knight first because he shamed him and his court.
Yeah, that's a fascinating moment. So, as you can imagine, a guy walks in, he's all dressed in green, he has an axe. He says, "Hey, someone want to cut off my head and I'll cut off your head." Everyone is stunned, right? Because this seems like perhaps this is a person who is insane, and would it be right to chop off the head of an insane person? And so everyone refrains from responding. And that is when the Green Knight shames Arthur's court, and says, "Wow, I heard so much about you, and you are all cowards. No one will play my game." And so that accusation is so powerful. The only way to redress it, to fix it, is for Arthur to say, "All right, I'm the head of this court. I've got to show you that we are not cowards." We're just a little startled. So Arthur gets up and says, "I'll do it." And now right away, we can see the problem, because although the Arthurian community in every text is a community founded on violence, right? This is how Arthur becomes king. He solidifies his right to rule. He has got to conquer. He's got to engage in conquest. He's got to create allies on the battlefield. Once you have him in position, you don't want to risk the life of the king. You need him not to die. Otherwise, there's instability and chaos. So when the king stands up to redress and address this insult from the Green Knight, then the situation's even more dire, because we cannot possibly risk the life of the king. And here is where Gawain shows both how honorable he is and how clever. Because the first thing he does when this becomes clear is he jumps up and he says, "No, please let me do it." And then he says of himself, "I am the lowliest knight here. So if my head gets chopped off, won't be a big deal." And of course, this is what we would call a humility topos. Gawain's a great knight, but by saying, "I'm the worst of the knights here," it makes all the other knights look amazing. But also, notice how polite he is. He does not say, "Dude, Uncle Arthur, give me this, like, give me the axe. You cannot do this." He asks permission. He says to his uncle and his king, "Would you do me the honor of letting me do this, please?" I mean, he gives a nice speech about how, "I would like to have the opportunity to do this. I'm not well known," but he puts it in Arthur's hands entirely. So he reestablishes the equilibrium where Arthur's the king and he's in charge. And if Arthur's feeling generous, he can go ahead and grant this request. But Gawain, first of all, has to ask Guinevere, "Is it okay if I do this?" So he's following all the norms. And right away, that reestablishes the order of Arthur's court, puts Arthur back on top, and then Arthur saves face because he can then decide, do I want to do this myself, or shall I extend this favor to young Gawain, who's asked me so nicely for the chance to have his head chopped off? And that shows from the beginning that Gawain is working in the best interest of the court, even if it means his own life might be sacrificed. And that then, in turn, speaks to the level of honor and stature of Arthur's court generally, that there are knights who are willing to sacrifice their lives to maintain that honor.
Yeah, and it does seem that in the end, everybody recognizes that, he is working in the best interest of the court. And as you said, they're all going to wear these green sashes or symbols, and it's not a symbol of shame anymore. And yeah.
It's a symbol of honor because that was a rough situation and you did a pretty good job, Gawain.
Yeah. I mean, why is it's a huge question, but why is King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table such a popular myth? Because before we started, I told you that I've listened to so many of your courses, and you said that your favorite one was the one about Arthur, and you are a scholar of Arthurian literature. So, what do you find in there, and I mean, because we are talking about a poem, and essentially, you said that it started in 600.
So, what I would say about the Arthurian legend, one reason it has been so enduringly popular, there are a few reasons. One is that it has been and can be adapted to any age or time period. And so every age writes an Arthur that is an ideal leader or produces an Arthurian court that imparts important lessons for that time period. So if you're looking at a 12th century text, Arthur and his knights look like 12th century kings and knights. In the 15th century, the workings of the court very much resemble a 15th century court, or what would be considered the ideal of a 15th century court. So it's very adaptable, it's very malleable, and the other part that makes it so attractive is that it has this ever expanding universe of other knights. So it's not just the story of Arthur the king. After he takes the throne, he wins a few wars, but he steps back and then his knights act as agents for him. And I think of the Arthurian legend as a magnet, and over time it attracts to it other stories. So almost any hero can become a knight of Arthur's court, and therefore you get to include their adventures. A good example is Sir Tristan. His legend was originally not part of the Arthurian legend. He had his own textual literary traditions, great series of adventures. But guess what? If we make him a knight of the Round Table, then Arthurian literature gets to include all of his stories within its compass. And I think that that is part of what it does, is that it looks for quests that might be appropriate for Arthur and his knights. So, for example, the Grail quest comes in quite late to the Arthurian legend. But that seems like a great thing for Arthur and his knights to be participating in. So let's take it and let's stick it into the Arthurian legend. And it does that with so many other things. So the whole panoply of medieval literary romance tradition of knights and conquest and ladies and chivalry and courtly love, any story that has to do with any of those things, those characters can be brought into the Arthurian legend. So it just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and it encompasses, in the end, almost the whole world of the medieval chivalric tradition.
Yeah, I mean, when we think about a king, a medieval king, we usually think about Arthur, like he's the first one, I guess. And I'm interested. Is David Lowry? I mean the director and
Mhm.
writer of the Green Knight. He's probably not the first to create an Arthurian story that actually undermines the values of chivalry.
Uh, I would say not as much undermines as depicts how complicated and sometimes contradictory it can be. And we actually see this all the way back in the Middle Ages, though, and especially in Malory's text, where he has knights swear to uphold and follow certain values, but sometimes those values will conflict with each other, and there's no guidance as to how to deal with that when it happens. And this creates a problem. So, for example, one of the best examples from Malory is the knights have sworn that they will always serve ladies, and another clause is they will always give mercy to someone who asks for mercy. And this knight, Sir Tor, is out on his first adventure, and he is fighting with another knight, and along comes a maiden, and she says, Sir Tor, as you are knight of King Arthur's court, I ask that you give me a gift. As any of us could tell you right now, that's a bad idea to say, yes, I'll give you a gift and not know what she's going to ask. We call that the rash boon tradition. And she's invoked his knighthood. She's invoked his status as a member of the Round Table. He says, of course, lady, because he has to serve ladies. Of course, I shall do that. And and then she says, okay, I want the head of this knight. At which point the knight says, I ask for mercy. And Tor's like, I'm supposed to do both. I'm supposed to give this lady what she wants, and I'm
Yeah.
supposed to cut off this knight's head, and I'm supposed to give him mercy. What do I do? And essentially he decides, well, she asked first. But right there, you see that's a like this is a problem, and the Arthurian tradition never completely resolves it. And that's why I think films like Lowry's are so great in that they take us below the surface of the text and show us a great deal of the complexity, the difficulty, and the contradictory nature of the chivalric ethos.